Hey everyone, I wanted to make a bit of a different post since this is something I've wanted to do for quite a while. What you're seeing in the background currently is me playing one of my favorite games, Hollow Knight. And I'm fighting one of the bosses called Broken Vessel. Now, originally I wanted to have it be a clip of me fighting one of my favorite bosses of Hollow Knight, but I had to stick with the color theme, which is currently on orange. So maybe another time with that. But anyway, this video isn't about my favorite video game. But I wanted to make this to share about some of my personal takeaways from the book of Philemon. This summer, I took some of my time in studying through it, and it actually started partially over a year ago. There's a YouTuber, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but his name is Wendigoon, and he kind of does more paranormal and conspiracy theory, cryptid type videos, but he's also a Christian. And over a year ago, he posted a video called The Most Underrated Book in the Bible. And one of my friends showed it to me, and we started watching at least the introductory bit of it. And it was him actually talking about the book of Philemon. Well, I didn't watch it all the way at that point, but over a year later, I had some free time one day, and I'm like, it popped up on my feed, so I'm like, all right, let's watch this. And so I watched it. It was like 30-ish minutes or so, and I was like, oh, okay, I kind of see where he's coming from. So now, at the time, I was finishing up my last Greek class, and I wanted to keep up my Greek reading and exegetical work, and so I had a plan to go through the book of Philemon because it was kind of short, and I wanted to challenge myself in a little bit more, I guess, more intermediate Greek, so something beyond John's letters, if that makes sense. So I chose Philemon, and my method was to read, start off with verse 1, and then I'll read verses 1 and 2, and then 1, 2, 3, and then 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. And each day I'll translate the new verse, and after a certain amount of verses, I'll just kind of do some more exegetical work at the end of each week. And it became a fun time. I thoroughly enjoyed doing that study through Philemon. And I wanted to talk about just kind of some takeaways. And after studying it myself, I would have to agree with what Wendigoon says, that it's the most underrated book of the Bible. I forget if he gave why he thinks it is, but I want to give my reasoning. For one, it's such a short book. It's only 25 verses, and it's not the longest. It's not the shortest book in the Bible, but it's one of the shortest books, and so it can be easily overlooked because of its size. The other thing that I've noticed is that Philemon is not as full of theological content. If you compare Titus, which goes right before it, it's a pastoral epistle, so it has much more church-related content. And then Hebrews is all about basically how the Old Testament points to Jesus and how Jesus is better than the shadows of the Old Covenant, which is one of my personal favorite things to study. But Philemon doesn't really have stuff like that as much, and so I think that's one of the bigger reasons why it's so overlooked, just because it doesn't have that kind of theological content as some of those other books. But that's just my take on why I think it's so underrated, because I really think it is, and I think people need to read it more and see what this book is all about. So some of the things that I worked through when I was studying it, I found out that verse 6 was one of the most surprisingly difficult verses to translate and exegete in the Greek, just because some of the words are used, like koinonia, and the genitive phrase for I think it would be pronounced tone piston, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly. If you know what I'm referring to, you know. But it's difficult because it could be translated in so many ways, and the genitive case has I don't know, like 50 uses or something for it. So it's rather difficult to see that or to translate that. But Douglas Moo seemed to have a really good explanation for that. For Paul is basically praying that Philemon's faith can become effective in leading to understand and put into practice all the good God has in store for us. And so that was a rather interesting verse to look at. Also, I'm gonna nerd out a lot, but Philemon has one of the few times that the optative mood is used, which is a sort of wishing or desire, if I remember correctly. Again, if you know what I'm referring to, you know what I mean. I'm just being a Greek geek here. But really the biggest thing that I got from reading the book of Philemon is how God works behind the scenes of everything. Like in verses 15 and 16, Paul kind of teases to Philemon that this idea that God is the one who kind of orchestrated all these events, where he says perhaps this is why Onesimus was separated from you, so that you can receive him back eternally, no longer as a slave, but more than that, as a brother, as a beloved brother, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Basically, because if you think about it, like a slave runs away from his master, just so happens to flee to Rome, and just so happens to find himself in the house of the Apostle Paul that he's under house arrest in, just so happens to become a believer under Paul and raised up in that faith by him. And Paul just so happens to know the master of the slave, who he just so happens to be able to write to while he's in house arrest. Like, that doesn't just happen. That doesn't just happen haphazardly. Like, it shows that God orchestrates all the events all of our events, all the events in our lives. Gosh, I can't talk. In a way, to give us opportunities to embody Christ in front of both believers and in front of the world. And you see that as Paul transforms Onesimus from someone who was useless, as Paul described him formerly, to now someone who is useful as a servant of the gospel and is now a brother on equal ground with Philemon, which just goes to show that God orchestrates events and transforms us to embody Christ. In fact, that's kind of the big idea that I would put the book of Philemon, or to summarize, that's how I would summarize the book of Philemon, that how that applies to us today, that God is orchestrating all events and has transformed us so that we can embody Christ. Because you see with the example of Paul, with Philemon, with Onesimus, that they have all been changed, whether years ago or more recently, to embody the mind of Christ, which Paul does write about in some of his other letters. And it gives this example of how we have these times to embody Christ today. So with that being said, I want to probe some questions for you all, that how will you respond when there may be times when a Christian or a more recent converted Christian that you've kind of had some estrangement or falling out with will return to you one day. And so how are you going to respond to that? Or there may be times where you would have to be the one to approach a fellow believer that you had a falling out with. How are you going to do that? Or like Paul, you might even have to be the one to encourage one Christian to receive another in the same way Paul pleads with Philemon to receive Onesimus. That's another thing too. I completely forgot about that. Oh my goodness. I'm going to backtrack a little bit, but if you look at the beginning of the book of Philemon, Paul introduces himself as a prisoner of Christ Jesus. I made a post on this already, but I'm going to say it anyway because I just thought of it. But if you look at the other introductions of Paul, he typically either refers to himself as an apostle or a slave. But Philemon is very unique where he refers to himself as a prisoner. It's the only time he does that in the introduction. And I think that really sets the tone of the letter, where as he's pleading with Philemon to welcome back in Onesimus. And I think there may be times where we have to do that as well. And so on what basis are we going to appeal to those Christians? It's times like those that show where we can show who Christ is, and it's those times where we can see that God is orchestrating events and transforming us to embody Christ. So those are just a few takeaways that I got while studying the book of Philemon. It's a little bit of a lengthy video and kind of just rambling. This is kind of just something I did spur of the moment, so there's cuts and interruptions. Blame me. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this little bit of a different style of content. Maybe if you guys want to see more like this, let me know. And see you around. Bye.